And one of the things we're going to see in chapter 12 is the martyrdom of St. James, and at the same time the miraculous rescue of St. Peter. And one of the questions that can easily cross our minds is, why did God allow James to die, yet miraculously save Peter? And the fact of the matter is that life is usually full of difficult questions like this that we come across. Why is one child physically disabled, yet another child is, athletically gifted? Why do people die before realizing their full potentials, and others live, yet they live in evil and live in sin? And the fact is, we can't possibly answer questions like this in this life because we don't see, we don't have this ability to see all that God sees. He chose for St. Peter, for St. James to be martyred. However, St. Peter's journey still needed to continue. He still had work that God wanted fulfilled on his hands. And this is the simplest answer. We each have a job that we need to fulfill. Once we fulfill this job, God then allows us to go to our place of rest. If you hear what St. Paul says, he says, I have a desire to be with God. I have a desire for this life to end. But if you continue to the end of that verse, you find he says, but for your sake, I'm still here. I have a desire to go, but unfortunately, there is work for me that I still need to continue. And for that work, I will still be alive. And this is the answer. St. Peter still had a lot of work to complete. And for that, God miraculously saved him from the prison, as we see, unlike St. James. Let's start reading. Chapter 12, verse 1, in the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hands to harass some from the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And because he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. So when he had arrested him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after Passover. King Herod Agrippa I was the son of Aristobulus and the grandson of Herod the Great. This is the Herod that St. Luke is telling us extended his hand and was the person who killed St. James, who gave him his crown of martyrdom. His sister is someone we know very well. His sister is Herodias. Does anyone know who Herodias is? She was the one that was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. She's the one that danced, and she's the one that asked for the head of St. John the Baptist on a platter. Now this Herod was partly Jewish. And because he was partly Jewish, the Romans used him and appointed him to rule over most of the territories of Palestine and the territories that surround Palestine, such as Galilee, such as Judea and Samaria. But he persecuted Christians, and as you can see in the first verse, this persecution of the Christians, he found that it appeased the Jews. It actually pleased the Jewish leaders. And therefore, he was doing this, and he persecuted the Christians in order to please these Jewish leaders who oppose the Christians, hoping that this was going to solidify his position, to give him more power, to give him the ability to control his territories, which were mostly Jewish inhabited, better. We will learn about his death in the book of Acts. But what is actually quite amazing is not just the way he died, but his death was also recorded by a historian called Josephus. Josephus is a historian who recorded the death, and we will see what kind of evil death, what kind of difficult death this Herod is going to experience. Now, James and John were the two sons of Zebedee. So this James that died, because there is another James, yes? And we will see the other James later in chapter 12. The other James is the brother-in-law of the Lord, who was the first bishop of Jerusalem, and he presided over the first synod, as we could say, which occurs in the book of Acts. But this James is the the son of Zebedee. Does anyone remember a very famous story about James and John? Yes, the two sons of Zebedee. What did they ask for? One to sit on the right and the left. So the first was the first disciple to be martyred, St. James. St. John, does anyone know who St. John is? Which John is it that we're talking about? John the Beloved, who wrote the Revelations. And what happened to him? He wasn't martyred. He was the only one that was not martyred, and he was exiled into Malta, where he wrote the book of Revelation. Now what we see here is the circumstances around the laying of the hands or the arresting of St. Peter, seizing of Peter, it was different to that of St. James, in that the circumstances were interrupted by the feast of the Passover. And what St. Luke goes out of his way to record for us is he tells us that this king, this Herod, didn't just bring Peter and put him in jail. No, he put him in jail, and it says to us in verse 4, and delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after Passover. So here, he's actually put 4 groups of soldiers that would take turns to ensure that in every period of supervision, there are 4 soldiers. 2 of them are actually tied with chains to St. Peter, and 2 are actually standing at the door, guarding the doors. I want you to imagine the kind of prison this was, and the kind of security that was placed over St. Peter. He had each arm chained to a soldier, with 2 soldiers standing outside the door, guarding the door. And it was 4 groups of 4 that kept on rotating across the air, the 24 hours. What was wrong with Herod? He did not want to lose St. Peter. He wanted to make sure that he can also deliver St. Peter. Why? Because he's being delivered on just after Passover. And you see what Herod was trying to build? He was trying to get become very, very visible, because that's the time when most of the Jews would be in Jerusalem. And therefore, he was trying to make a statement through martyring St. Peter after he martyred St. James. And he was truly using it as a way of really controlling the territories that he was in charge of. Then comes the miracle. The miracle wrecked all Herod's strategy. His strategy, he was trying to impress as many Jews as he could. And it's obvious that he really carefully planned to execute Peter just after Passover, like James. But what he didn't plan for, and what we will see was happening, is that the whole church was praying for Peter's safety. The whole church was asking for Peter to be delivered. And this prayer significantly affected the outcome of the events. And that's part of God's plan and God's work. Verse 5, Peter was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. And when Herod was about to bring him out, that night, Peter was sleeping, bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers, and the guards before the door were keeping the prison. Now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shone in the prison. And he struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, "Arise quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. Then the angel said to him, "Gird yourself and tie on your sandals." And so he did. And he said to him, "Put on your garment and follow me." So he went out and followed him, and did not know that was done by the angel was real. Did not know that what was done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. When they were past the first and the second guard posts, they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which opened to them of its own accord, and they went out and went down one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. See, God sent an angel to rescue St. Peter. And this angel appears to St. Peter and tries to wake him up. But what is most amazing when you read this is, I want you to underline these 2 verses. Peter was sleeping. Now, which night is this? This is the night before his execution. I want you to think. You know that you're being executed tomorrow. This king has gone out of his way to prepare for your execution. This king has extreme security around you. 2 soldiers tied to each of your arms, 2 soldiers at the door. And Jerusalem is going to be full of people, so you are going to become a spectacle for people. You're becoming an example that is being used. You're politically being used strategically to threaten and to scare all Christianity, but to you, it's your last night. It's your last night alive. How many of us will be able to sleep? لا ده مش بس نايم، ده آخر نومة. Notice, he's sleeping, he's so fast asleep to the extent that the angel had to strike him to wake him up. Imagine, I want you to imagine the kind of sleep. I feel like saying to Peter, Peter, how could you have slept through this. No. See, St. Peter was in absolute peace. You know these verses when St. Paul says, for me, death is gain. These disciples, these saints truly experienced that. And the proof of that experience, or of this experience, his ability to sleep the night before he is surely going to be executed. You know, it's so obvious there was no way out. There was no way for him to live. And Peter himself also witnessed the death of James. So he saw that, his James, his brother, or James, his fellow disciple who lived with him, he saw him being executed, and it's my turn. Yet he sleeps in absolute peace, to the extent that the angel has to actually go out of his way to wake him up. And the angel says to St. Peter, come and follow me. St. Luke goes out of his way to tell us that St. Peter, whilst he woke up, he thought he was still in a vision. He didn't fully realize what was happening. But what is very obvious is the greatness of this miracle. That the chains melt off his hands, and he walks out from all the prison doors, to the extent that he arrives to the door of this that leads into the city out of the prison, and the door just opens in front of him. That tells us that he was really in one of the most secure prisons that had many doors. And this is a prison that was obviously for those who were sentenced to death. But in front of St. Peter, nothing is impossible. Why? Because God is the one that will open any impossible doors that may actually confront us in life. In verse 11, we see that finally Peter is going to come to his senses, or he's going to wake up. It says to us that, and when Peter had come to himself, he said, now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod, from all the expectation of the Jewish people. And here St. Peter really comes to the realization that I have been saved. I have been saved by God's mighty hand, who did not wish for me to become that spectacle in front of all those Jewish people. So St. Peter is going to make his way to the rest of the disciples. Now, where were the rest of the disciples? They were all in St. Mark's house, the upper room. Yes. So St. Mark, who wrote the Gospel of St. Mark, who preached to our church, to Egypt, who came, St. Mark, his house was that first church. And his mother's house. His mother's house. It was large enough to contain many believers. One day I hope we get to go to Palestine. I know this was planned for this year, but we didn't plan it to go to Palestine and Jerusalem. So hopefully next year we can plan it, now that travel is open again. And I know for a fact some of the fathers that went, they actually went and visited St. Mark's house. So it was large enough to accommodate many believers, and this is where the upper room actually existed, where the Last Supper took place. So Peter is going to go to that house. So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. But they said to her, "You are beside yourself." Yet she kept insisting that it was so. So they said, "It is his angel." Now Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But motioning to them with his hands to keep silent, he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, "Go tell these things to James and the brethren." And he departed and went to another place. See, the church continued to pray. And the church was living in prayer for the problem that was at hand, which was the arrest and the imminent martyrdom of St. Peter. But when the answer arrived, and when St. Peter arrived at the door, many did not believe it. And it's like St. Luke here is displaying to us real life with a sense of humor in this part of the story. Why? Because you can see this young woman so overcome with amazement and relief and joy that she was beside herself with emotion. She'd been praying for the release of St. Peter. The whole church was there praying for God to save St. Peter. When St. Peter was saved, they found it difficult to believe, to the extent that when she went to the rest of the church and said to them that Peter is at the door, they all thought it was the angel of Peter. The angel of Peter, that is, means that they thought that Peter had been executed, and this is his spirit or his angel coming to visit them, to comfort them before it rises or it goes to heaven. On the contrary, it was Peter himself. And when they went and they opened the door, they found or they learned that their prayer was answered, and it was answered miraculously. This miracle is what St. Peter explains to them and tells them to go and tell St. James, who is the brother of Christ. But he goes to another place. Now, many tell us that this other place that St. Peter went to is most likely Egypt. He went to St. Mark, who was in Egypt. And this we get from the fact that he writes there's one of the 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13 where he actually says that he is at the gates of Babylon. The gates of Babylon is actually Old Cairo, the gate of Babylon. If those of you that came with us again to Egypt, it's where the St. George's nunnery is where the 7 churches are. There's the hanging church, then there's St. George's Greek church, and then there's the nunnery downstairs. When we went down the stairs and we visited the nunnery, those steps were called steps of the gate of Babylon, and it is believed that that's where St. Peter was. Now, some others believe that he went to Babylon, which is in Iraq. The Catholics believe that he went to Rome, which is where he instituted the church or the seat of Rome, but that is most likely impossible. So it's either Egypt or Iraq. We believe that it was Egypt because this is where he met St. Mark, or where he was with St. Mark, which is what he says in 1 Peter 5:13, that he was with St. Mark in the gates of Babylon, which is in Egypt. Then, verse 18, then as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers about what had happened of Peter. But when Herod had searched for him and not found him, he examined the guards and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. Obviously, Herod, he was defeated. Defeated, it was no small matter for someone like Peter, who was under extreme security, to disappear from the prison. Verse 20, now Herod had been very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, but they came to him with one accord, and having made Blastus, the king's personal aide, their friend, they asked for peace because their country was supplied with food by the king's country. Tyre and Sidon are two cities that used to actually receive their food from Galilee. And this had happened historically. The only way you could get to Tyre and Sidon is through any kind of freight, if you think, can only happen through Galilee. And because King Herod controlled Galilee, Judea, and all the regions around Palestine, it is obvious that he had cut off supplies to those that live, the people of Tyre and Sidon. He had been very angry with them. He'd cut supplies to them, which means that they were very hungry. And what he has done here is, it tells us that those people became friendly with the king's personal aid. Why? They were trying to get food to be supplied to their country. What is it that's going ahead? So on a set day, verse 21, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat on his throne and gave an oration to them. And the people kept shouting, the voice of a God and not of a man. Then immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give glory to God, and he was eaten by worms and died. But the word of the law of God grew and multiplied. Here it looks like Herod went out of his way to boast. He put on this beautiful apparel. It tells us he put on his royal apparel to really inflict further pain on the people of Tyre and Sidon, to tell them, I'm the one that's in control. I'm the one that has your life in my hand. Whether you live or you die, this is in my hand. And therefore, he was displaying in front of them how great and how glorious he is. And then you find St. Peter goes and tells us that on a set day, if you look at Josephus, he actually tells us what that day that was. It was the day of honoring Claudius Caesar, either his birthday or his day of sitting on the throne. And Herod actually is recorded to have died on that day. And this is recorded in the history, and it is recorded for us here by St. Luke. But out of all this, we find St. Luke tells us that this person, this king that died, lived his life trying to destroy the church, trying to stop the preaching of the word, trying to kill, or having killed St. James, trying to kill St. Peter. He was seeking to stop the church. But on the other hand, we have God who was protecting the church, insisting on the church to grow. Herod dies, but the church continues to grow, continues to multiply, continues to extend to the ends of the earth. Finally, chapter 12 gives us a very quick 2 verses to tell us. If you remember, in the end of chapter 11, Barnabas took Saul and they went to Antioch. So it tells us that both, just right at the end, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry, and they also took with them John, whose surname was Mark. He telling us that they have come back from Jerusalem, that they had, what had happened in Jerusalem, if you remember in chapter 11, is the Christians were no longer allowed to enter into the altar, were no longer allowed to enter into the temple. And the Christians were cut off, and the Christians weren't allowed to trade. All the Jewish Christians were persecuted. And what is happening here, God allowed for the church to continue to grow, for the church to have a new center in Antioch, and to have Paul and Barnabas, 2 great apostles, who come and actually serve the needs of the poor in Jerusalem. And it's recorded for us here that both Paul and Barnabas came back from Jerusalem to Antioch after they finished serving all the poor that was there, and that they brought back with them St. Mark, who is the son of the sister of Barnabas. So Mary, St. Mark's mother, happens to be St. Barnabas's sister, and St. Mark begins and goes to begin to serve with them, to minister with them, to preach with them, who eventually comes to Egypt and preaches to us Christ. And with this we end chapter 12. God willing, next week we see how the church is going to continue to grow and how they're going to preach in Cyprus and then in Antioch, and how the church will continue to grow, and glory be to God forever and ever. Amen. It's St. Paul's first missionary journey starts in chapter 13 that we will begin with, God willing, next week. That was a very quick 1 chapter. Whole chapter from beginning to end. It's a beautiful chapter. Any questions? La? I thought there was going to be a lot of questions on James and Peter. Actually, you had to dig, didn't you? Yes. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This is a problem when we try and calculate our will rather than God's will. And if anything we can learn from this story, each of us is unique. I am me, and I'm going to live my life, not anyone else's life. I'm going to live Joshua's life. I shouldn't look at Jonah's life and compare, because that's what we tend to do as humans, unfortunately. Continuously looking at other people's lives around us. And even sometimes as close as siblings, looking at my brother's life or my sister's life. You're going to live your life. And to each of us, there is a task that has been allocated. Some of us, our task is going to finish quickly, and God will allow for us to be martyred, even in this day and this age. You look at someone like a Father Mina Aboud, young priest. I could look at him and say, how come he finished so quick and was given the crown of martyrdom, and here I am still alive and growing old? He finished his mission. And I am not him. I am me. You look at the young men in Libya. Such a promising life ahead of them. But their mission was finished. In the eyes of God, their role here on earth was done. They were gifted the gift of the martyrdom. And their martyrdom preached to the whole world. I know I told you the story of Thomas in Japan, yeah? Thomas, he was preached to by the 21 martyrs, not by me. They are the ones that preached Christianity to him. He came to me carrying their picture, walking into the church and saying, I want to be baptized. They'd done all the work. For I need to always just focus on my life, not anyone else's life. Not my brother, not my sister, not my uncle, not my son, not my daughter, no one else, my life. Don't compare your life to others. In this case, we had St. James. His life was, he was going to be on the right side. He's going to be the first disciple to be martyred. Yes, St. Peter still had long to live. In the end, he was also martyred. Yeah, in the end, St. Peter was martyred, sah? Yes? He still died by the sword and still died a martyr, but in God's time, not in his time. Yes? And definitely not in Herod's time. All right. No more questions? Yes? No, it's a very, very short question. Very, very short answer. When you are one with Christ. You know, it would have been very, very hard for me to try and convince you that St. Peter was asleep. All I have to do is, I was just talking about the 21 martyrs. We play their video. And look at them. Look at the peace that was on each of their faces. They were one with Christ. This is the difference when I connect with God. And I truly have faith that His will occurs in my life. It's only then that I can be like Peter, like St. Paul, who says, nothing will separate me from the love of Christ. No prison, no torture, no sword, nothing is going to separate me from the love of God. And because nothing is going to separate me, I will be able to sleep, even though I know that tomorrow I'm going to be executed. On the contrary, I will even sleep a better sleep because I know tomorrow I'll be arriving at the feast in heaven with my Christ whom I love. It's the difference. And this is, if you really want to check it, go back and look at the 21 Martyrs video and have a look at their faces and the peace that they were at. The whole world could not understand how they were at peace. That is the fruit of the Spirit. So when you come to define peace, use their photo, not the dove that the rest of the world uses. That's not peace. Yes? خلاص? Can we pray? مالكوا زعلتوا ليه؟ كلكوا زعلانين ومتكلمين كده.